Hello, and welcome to this video tutorial on how to set up an importer in Merge1. Importers do the bulk of the work in Merge1 and are the final component to be set up. In order to set up an importer, at least a connector and a target must have already been set up. Any desired filters should also have been created. I've already opened the Merge1 console. To add an importer, right-click on Importers and select Add Importer. Every importer has 7 tabs. For most cases, only the Components, Settings, Scheduler, and Service Account tabs need to be used. But for this tutorial, I will walk through each of the tabs and describe what the various options can be used for. The Components tab is where the previously configured connector, target, and filters are added to the importer. Select a connector from the drop-down list, and then a default target. In this case, I'll use a pre-configured Bloomberg connector with test data, and a general SMTP target that I've already created. It is important to note that each connector or target can only be associated with one importer. Next, select Enable Filtering if a filter or multiple filters will be used by the importer. The unconditional Hit Default Target checkbox is used to make sure that if a message is caught by a filter, it will be sent to both the default target as well as the designated filter target. Multiple filters can be added to each importer. As a message is marked as a hit to a particular filter, it will be routed to the filter target. The filter priority can be adjusted by selecting a filter and moving it up or down in the table. If messages should be routed via multiple filters, the Process All Filters box should be checked. This will route a message that registers a hit on multiple filters to each individual filter target. For this case, I will not be adding a filter. With the Components tab complete, click the Processing tab. In general, the Processing tab is used for troubleshooting and customizing the import. From Processing Options, most users will only use the default setting of Process All Messages. This will initially attempt to process failed messages before moving on to new messages. Process New Messages will only process new messages and will ignore any failed messages. Process Failed Messages Only will allow the user to reprocess failed messages with adjusted settings. Below the processing options, the user has the ability to add a note to messages that have been forced to import. These are useful when processing messages that have missing attachments or disclaimers. The content options are all turned on by default. Strip Group Address Info applies to EML connectors. With this option, the header information for recipient addresses, such as to or CC, will be removed by the importer. Set Content Disposition is also related to the EML connector. It relates to how the importer should deal with images attached to emails. Set Display Name to SMTP address when empty is turned on by default and will add a display name to a message in the case that it is missing. The final section of the Processing tab is the Match Email Address section. These options can be used to further filter and customize the output message using a CSV file to replace values. To learn more about these options, refer to the user guide. I'll leave the importer to the default settings, as this will be the case for most users. Click Apply, and then select the Settings tab. The Settings tab will for the most part be left as default by users. The first section on the Settings tab is Enable Import Throttling. This is an advanced option that allows the user to decide how much data should be processed before Merge1 takes a break in processing. This can be useful if Merge1 is based on a server that is used for other utilities, or if files are exceptionally large. The Queues and Threads section allows the user to define what resources Merge1 can use to process messages. These settings are most commonly used for large organizations processing large quantities of data. The maximum target section can generally be left as default, but is generally used in the case that the intended target is unstable. As I mentioned earlier, many users, especially those troubleshooting merge1, will need to enable logging using the logging section. The Windows event log will monitor merge1, and these logs can be accessed through the Windows Event Viewer. Alternatively, these logs can be written to a specific file location. Globanet support staff will often ask for these logs for troubleshooting. An important note about these logs is that if the logs go unwritten after logging is enabled, it usually means that the account information has not been specified on the Service Account tab. I will select a log file location that is in the Bloomberg Processing folder I specified on the connector setup. Click Apply to save the settings and select the Message Headers tab. This tab allows users to add custom headers to the converted message. It is mostly used for customizing how messages are indexed and labeled for search purposes. The Include Full Header Information option allows header information to be added to the message body in addition to the message header. This data will be added to a metadata section at the bottom of the message. These headers can also be added to the import message as an HTML attachment. For the purposes of this tutorial, I'll add a message header called Custom Header with a value of custom value so that we can see it in the imported messages. I'll also turn on full message headers for the message body to show how this information is added to the imported message. The setup of the Message Headers tab is now complete. Click Apply to save the settings and select the Reporting tab. The Reporting tab is used to send a message with detailed information about each run of the importer. The first section is the reporter level. For most users, the Generate Summary Report Only option is adequate. The summary report will have basic information such as how many files were imported and how many failed. The other two options will give more specific information about each file converted. Under Miscellaneous, keep the default settings. When the box is unchecked, the log will keep an extended list of message counts and statistics rather than starting over at each run. The Email Report Settings is the most involved section of this tab. Add the SMTP server and port to be used to send the report email. Then fill in the sender email, sender name, and recipient email. Use the Send Test email to ensure that the reporting mechanism is working. Click Apply to save the settings and select the Scheduler tab. The Scheduler tab is important as it decides when the importer will run. By default, the importer is set to run once, but this should only be used when trying to import failed messages. The user should decide the best interval for the importer to run, keeping in mind that if it is scheduled too frequently, it can cause conflict errors. Click the Show Schedule button to define the schedule. For the purposes of this exercise, we'll keep the default checked and only run the importer once. There is also an option on this tab to run the importer immediately. Click Apply to save the settings and select the Service Account tab. The Service Account tab is where the current Windows user information is entered to allow logs to be written. Enter the account name, including the PC name, and the appropriate password. Click OK to finish the importer setup. The importer has now been added to the merge1 console. I'll now run the importer to show the results of the setup. If you look at each message, notice that the metadata information has been attached below the metadata itself. I specified this setting on the Message Headers tab. The custom header that I added is also included in this information. Notice the log file has also been sent via SMTP and has information about the import. This concludes the tutorial on adding an importer in merge1. I hope that this guide has been helpful. As always, if there are any questions or problems, contact Globinet support at support@globinet.com.